My name is Mark Doyle, and I owned the only private dock on Silver Pine Lake. That summer, the HOA president decided my dock belonged to everyone. She smiled at block parties while quietly rewriting the rules behind my back. Then came the wedding invitation nailed to my own boathouse door. 200 guests. My dock as the altar. I said no. He decided. By the end of that night, everyone on that lake would learn who really owned that water. I'm 42, an electrician by trade, married to Sarah for 15 years, with a 12-year-old son named Cole who lived for summer mornings on that dock. We'd bought the lake house in 2014, a modest place with a deeded private dock. The one thing that made the mortgage worth it. Silver Pine Lake Estates was a quiet HOA community outside town. The kind of place with a newsletter, a duck pond, and a woman named Deborah Ashworth who had run the board for 9 years like it was her personal kingdom, and nobody had ever successfully told her no. Debbie Ashworth wasn't loud. She was worse than loud. Meticulous, and always smiling when she delivered bad news, like a fine for an unapproved mailbox color or a warning letter about grass height measured to the quarter inch. She'd been HOA president since her husband Gary quietly stepped back from the board, and from what I could tell, Gary now mostly nodded along at meetings, refilling his coffee and avoiding eye contact whenever his wife raised her voice. My dock sat on a small deeded parcel, separate from the community's shared shoreline, something the original developer had carved out in 1987 for 4 lakefront lots. Debbie had never liked that arrangement. She called it an oversight that should have been corrected years ago. Every spring she'd mention, almost casually, that the HOA was reviewing shoreline access agreements. Every spring I'd remind her, just as casually, that my deed was recorded at the county clerk's office and hadn't changed since Reagan was president. My neighbor Ruth Kaplan, a retired attorney in her 70s, used to sit on her porch watching these exchanges with a small, knowing smile, like she was collecting something. I never asked what. That March, Debbie's daughter Chloe got engaged to a nice guy named Tyler Reyes, and within a week the community newsletter was already gushing about an exciting Silver Pine tradition in the making, whatever that meant. I remember Sarah laughing about it at dinner, saying Debbie would probably want to host the wedding on the clubhouse lawn. Neither of us imagined she had bigger water in mind. In April, Debbie stopped me in the parking lot outside the community mailboxes, complimenting my dock's gorgeous sunset view, a compliment I'd never once received from her in 9 years of fines and warning letters. Wouldn't it be something, she said, if Chloe got married right there, over the water, at sunset? I laughed, thinking she was joking. She wasn't smiling anymore by the time I stopped. A week later, a community events proposal appeared in every mailbox, describing a landmark HOA wedding celebration on the lake, complete with a rendering of a floating platform tied off exactly where my dock stood. I called the HOA office. The woman who answered said Debbie had already told everyone the Doyle family was thrilled to host, and had generously agreed to the arrangement. A sentence I had never spoken in my life. Sarah wanted to march straight to Debbie's house. I told her to wait, to get it in writing first, because I'd learned by then that anything Debbie said out loud eventually changed shape by the time it reached paper. That's when Ruth Kaplan finally spoke up, telling me quietly over the fence that she'd been keeping a file on Debbie's little arrangements for over a year. ever since a shoreline dispute of her own had mysteriously vanished from HOA meeting minutes. I didn't know yet how deep that file went. I just knew I needed my own copy of everything, starting immediately, because a woman who could invent my consent out of thin air could invent anything else too. By late April, laminated event signs had already gone up along the community trail, directing guests toward the Doyle family dock, wedding ceremony site, as if the matter had never required my permission at all. I marched to the HOA office and demanded the signs come down. Debbie met me with a folder, sliding across a photocopied shared amenity usage agreement, bearing what looked like my signature at the bottom. I'd never signed anything of the sort. The signature was close, unnervingly close, the kind of forgery you'd only notice if you knew your own handwriting the way I did after 20 years of work orders. "That's not my signature," I said. Debbie tilted her head, almost sympathetic. "Mark, we all sign a lot of paperwork. Memories fade." Behind her, I saw Gary staring hard at his shoes. I asked for the original document. Debbie said HOA policy required requests in writing, reviewed at the next scheduled board meeting, which happened to be 6 weeks away, conveniently after the wedding date. That night I photographed every fence post, every sign, every rendering, and emailed copies to myself, to Sarah, and to an account Ruth had quietly suggested I set up, just in case things got interesting. Sarah wanted to call a lawyer immediately. I still hoped this was something reasonable people could fix with one honest conversation. Because that's who I'd always been. The guy who assumed decency was the default setting. I requested a copy of my recorded deed from the county and brought it to the HOA office myself, laying it flat on the counter, pointing to the parcel lines that excluded my dock from any shared easement. Debbie barely glanced at it. "Deeds get outdated," she said. "The community has evolved since 1987. I asked her to point to a single HOA vote that had ever changed that boundary. She changed the subject. Word spread through the neighborhood fast. Some neighbors avoided my eyes at the mailbox, clearly warned off. Others, quietly, started leaving notes in my mailbox. Dates, times, screenshots of group chats where Debbie called me difficult. One note came from Priya Nair, the HOA board secretary, and signed but unmistakably typed on the same printer as the meeting minutes, containing 4 words, "Get everything in writing." I started attending every open session, recorder in my pocket, notebook in hand, watching Debbie perform warmth for the room while quietly steering every vote exactly where she wanted it before anyone else finished a sentence. At one meeting, I formally objected to using my dock without consent. Debbie thanked me for my input, then moved directly to a vote approving community wedding logistics, which somehow passed unanimously in under a minute. Gary abstained, where he didn't simply raise his hand the moment his wife did, and I noticed Priya glance at him like she was surprised too. That week, contractors showed up at my dock measuring pilings without asking. I told them to leave. Authorized temporary reinforcement work for an upcoming event. I had them escorted off by the county sheriff's deputy myself. Debbie called that evening, voice syrup sweet, saying she was so sorry for the confusion and that she'd handle it personally going forward. A phrase that, in hindsight, should have terrified me far more than it did. 2 days later, an anonymous complaint arrived at the county about unpermitted electrical work at my house. The exact kind of complaint that could only come from someone who knew my job, my schedule, and my address intimately. The inspector who came found nothing wrong. But the visit cost me a full day of work and a knot in my stomach that wouldn't loosen. I started keeping a written log of every incident. Dated, time-stamped, sourced. By early May, I understood something clearly. This wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. This was a campaign, run by a woman who had never once, in 9 years, lost a fight she cared about winning. I hired an attorney, a straightforward man named Dale Ferris who specialized in HOA disputes, and within a day he confirmed what the deed already told me. My dock parcel had never legally belonged to the shared easement. Dale drafted a formal cease and desist, delivered to the HOA office and mailed directly to Debbie's home, stating plainly that any wedding event on my property without consent would result in trespass and damages claims. Debbie's response arrived within 48 hours. A notice of violation, citing my dock's unpermitted structural modifications. A repair I'd made in 2019 with a permit still sitting in my filing cabinet at that very moment. At the next meeting, she read the violation aloud to the full room, letting the accusation hang in the air far longer than the correction that followed when I calmly produced the permit number from memory. I noticed something that night. 3 separate neighbors nodded slightly at me afterward. The kind of nod that says, "We see it too," without any of them daring to say a single word out loud in that room. Ruth cornered me in the parking lot and finally showed me her file. 2 years of documented incidents. Other homeowners fined for things Debbie's own family did without consequence. A pattern so consistent it read like a system, not a mistake. One entry stopped me cold. A $4,000 fine levied against a widow for unauthorized landscaping the same month Debbie's own backyard renovation. Twice the size. Sailed through with 0 paperwork on file at all. "She's been doing this for years," Ruth said. "Nobody's ever pushed back hard enough, long enough, with enough proof." I asked her why she'd never gone public herself. She said, quietly, that she'd been waiting for someone worth the fight. That comment sat with me for days. I wasn't looking to be anyone's champion. I just wanted my dock back, and my son's summer, and one honest answer from a woman who apparently didn't deal in those. The wedding planner, a tired-looking woman named Renata, approached me outside the grocery store, admitting Debbie still owed her firm $11,000 from a previous HOA gala, and she was terrified of losing this contract too. I asked Renata to keep records of every invoice and every excuse Debbie gave her. She hesitated, then agreed, saying quietly, "Somebody needs to stop being scared of that woman eventually." Meanwhile, the wedding preparations accelerated regardless of my cease and desist. As if Debbie had simply decided paperwork didn't apply to her the way boundaries never had. Floating dock sections arriving by flatbed truck that same week. I called Dale in a panic. He told me to document everything, avoid confrontation on camera, and let the paper trail build. Because in his experience, women like Debbie eventually overreach themselves into a corner with no exit. I didn't believe him yet. Workers stack lumber on the public boat ramp, clearly staging materials for a platform they still fully intended to build on water they didn't legally control. Sarah started sleeping badly, worried the fight was consuming our whole summer. Cole asked why the dock had keep-out tape on it now, and I didn't have a good answer that didn't sound bitter coming out of my mouth. At the June meeting, Debbie unveiled full wedding renderings on a projector, complete with fairy lights strung across the community dock area. A phrase she used 7 times without once looking in my direction. I stood up and asked, on the record, whether the board had reviewed my attorney's cease and desist letter. Debbie said the board took all correspondence seriously and moved immediately to new business before I could say another word. Priya, taking minutes, caught my eye for half a second. Later that night, an email arrived in my inbox from an address I didn't recognize, containing a screenshot of the board's private group chat. In the chat, Debbie had written, Doyle will fold once he sees how much backup we have. Nobody wants to be the neighbor who ruined Chloe's wedding. I read it 3 times before I fully understood what she meant. She wasn't planning to respect my property. She was planning to make defending it look monstrous, banking on the town's sympathy for a bride instead of the plain language of a recorded deed. I forwarded the screenshot to Dale. He said it was useful, but not yet enough, that we needed something concrete tying Debbie directly to authorizing construction on private land she didn't own. That weekend, I installed 2 trail cameras near my dock, aimed at the water and the access path, quietly, without telling anyone but Sarah, because I had learned by then that warnings only sped Debbie up. Within 4 days, the cameras caught contractors unloading a floating dance floor section directly onto my property line, with Debbie standing at the edge of the grass, gesturing instructions like a foreman on her own job site. I sent the footage to Dale immediately. He said we now had clear documentation of trespass and unauthorized construction. Enough for an emergency injunction if it came to that, but he still urged patience a little longer. Meanwhile, whispers around the neighborhood shifted. A few longtime residents started asking pointed questions at meetings about HOA dues, about repairs that never got made, about where exactly the reserve fund had gone over the years. Debbie deflected every question smoothly, pivoting to wedding logistics, community pride, coming together as a family, phrases that worked beautifully right up until Ruth quietly raised her hand and asked for the last 3 years of reserve fund statements. Debbie said the treasurer was still compiling those records. The treasurer, sitting 2 seats away, looked visibly confused, since he'd submitted his final report to the office 2 full months earlier. That night, Priya finally messaged me directly, admitting she'd been recording board meetings on her phone for months. For her own protection, she said, after Debbie once threatened to have her removed for asking too many questions. She sent me one recording, dated from March, of Debbie telling the treasurer to move some of the dues money into events. We'll true it up before the audit. A sentence that made my stomach drop for reasons that had nothing to do with my dock. I realized then this had never been about a wedding at all. It was about a woman who'd built 9 years of unchecked control, and my dock had simply become the stage where that control was about to be tested in public. Dale reviewed the recording carefully, said it was legally gray depending on state consent laws, but combined with financial statements, it could eventually support a fraud complaint if the money trail matched what Priya described. I asked Ruth if she wanted to go to the county with everything we had. She shook her head. If we move too early, she buries it faster than we can pull it out. So we waited, gathering more, cataloging every fine, every forged signature claim, every contractor invoice, every screenshot, building something Dale called a complete picture instead of a scattered pile of individual complaints. The wedding date, meanwhile, kept approaching, the second Saturday of July, exactly 3 weeks away, with save-the-date cards already mailed showing an illustration of a lakeside ceremony on what was unmistakably my dock. Chloe herself seemed oblivious to the fight, posting cheerful countdown videos online, tagging Silver Pine Lake, and thanking her mother for making every dream detail happen, completely unaware whose deed those dreams were standing on. 078, Tyler, her fiancé, seemed quieter, more careful, and once, at the community pool, he apologized to me privately, saying he'd asked Debbie twice whether the dock situation was fully sorted, and she told him it was. "She told me you were just being emotional about it," Tyler said, clearly uncomfortable repeating it. I thanked him for being honest, and told him this fight had never been with him or Chloe, only with his future mother-in-law. That conversation mattered more than I expected. It reminded me the people getting married were mostly innocent of the storm being built around them, and whatever happened next needed to land on Debbie, not on them. I told Dale I wanted a plan that stopped the illegal use of my property without turning Chloe's wedding day itself into a total disaster for two people who hadn't lied to my face. Dale said the cleanest path was a formal injunction before the wedding date, forcing Debbie to relocate the ceremony entirely, avoiding any dramatic confrontation on the day itself. It was the responsible plan. It was also, I'll admit, not what my gut wanted. Ruth, listening quietly, finally said what she'd clearly been thinking for weeks. "Sometimes the paperwork wins the case, Mark, but it never quite delivers the ending people actually needed to see." I didn't understand her fully yet. I just knew the injunction hearing was scheduled for the Thursday before the wedding, and Debbie, for the first time all summer, finally looked rattled when the court notice arrived. For a few days after the injunction filing, things went strangely quiet. No new signs appeared. No contractors showed up. Debbie stopped mentioning the wedding at community events entirely, which felt more unsettling than her usual confidence. Sarah wondered if she was finally backing down. I doubted it. Never Losing didn't quietly fold 3 weeks before their daughter's wedding without trying something else first. I kept the trail cameras running anyway, and kept my nightly log updated, because Ruth had taught me by then that Debbie's silences were rarely peace. They were reloading. Dale received a call from Debbie's own attorney, a smooth young man named Harlan Voss, requesting a settlement conversation before the injunction hearing, framing it as an opportunity to avoid unnecessary community conflict. The offer, when it came, was almost insulting. A one-time payment of $2,000 for temporary dock access rights, with a clause requiring me to withdraw all complaints and sign a non-disclosure about the forged agreement. I told Dale to reject it outright. $2,000 wasn't the point, and neither was the money at all. The point was a woman who thought she could manufacture consent and buy her way out when caught. That same week, Priya quietly resigned from the board via email, citing personal reasons, though she messaged me privately that she simply couldn't sit through another meeting pretending she hadn't seen what she'd seen. Her resignation created an opening. At the next informal gathering, 3 longtime homeowners approached me, asking if I'd consider running for the board myself in the fall elections, since apparently I wasn't the only one keeping a file anymore. I told them I wasn't interested in power, only in making sure whoever held it couldn't do what Debbie had done unchecked for nearly a decade. Ruth smiled at that answer like it was exactly the right one. Meanwhile, Renata, the wedding planner, called Dale directly, admitting under gentle questioning that Debbie had told her the HOA reserve account would cover final wedding overages, language that matched almost exactly what Priya's recording had captured months earlier. Dale filed a supplemental motion referencing possible misuse of HOA funds. Careful not to overreach, simply asking the court to require financial disclosure alongside the property injunction hearing already scheduled. Debbie's lawyer pushed back hard, calling the motion an irrelevant fishing expedition. But the judge's clerk confirmed both matters would now be heard together the following Thursday, 5 days before the wedding date. For the first time all summer, I felt something shift in my favor, not because I'd won anything yet, but because the ground under Debbie's control finally had real cracks running through it. Gary, of all people, called me one evening, voice tired, saying only, "I tried to slow her down years ago. I should have tried harder." He hung up before I could ask him anything else. I didn't know yet how much Gary actually knew, or how much he'd simply chosen not to see for the sake of an easy marriage. But his call told me the quiet was ending for everyone, not just me. The Thursday hearing arrived hot and overcast. The courthouse parking lot full of familiar faces from Silver Pine, some there to support me, others there simply because Debbie had told them the community's future was on trial. Debbie showed up in a tailored blazer, calm and composed, greeting neighbors warmly in the hallway as if she were hosting the event rather than defending against it. A performance so smooth it almost worked on me too. Dale presented the deed, the trail camera footage, and Renata's sworn statement about reserve fund conversations, laying each piece down methodically while Harlan Voss objected to nearly everything, mostly without success. Debbie testified that the usage agreement signature was mine, that she'd simply misplaced the original, and that any camera footage was selectively edited to make ordinary event planning look sinister. Under cross-examination, Dale asked her to produce the original signed document. She said her assistant likely had it. Her assistant, seated in the gallery, visibly paled and quietly shook her head at the question. The judge noted for the record that no original document had been produced despite multiple requests over several weeks, a detail that seemed to land harder in that room than anything Dale had said all morning. On the financial question, the judge declined to rule immediately but ordered a preliminary review of HOA reserve statements within 30 days. A small crack that Debbie's face couldn't quite hide despite her composed nodding. The property matter, however, was decided cleanly. The judge granted a temporary injunction barring any HOA-sponsored event on my dock parcel, effective immediately, until full ownership boundaries were formally resolved. Debbie left the courthouse without a word to me, jaw tight, Harlan Voss trailing behind her with a phone already pressed to his ear, presumably to whoever was supposed to deliver this news to Chloe. I should have felt triumphant. Mostly I felt exhausted and a little sick, knowing that somewhere a 26-year-old bride was about to learn her wedding location had just been legally erased 5 days out. That evening, Chloe called me directly, voice shaking, asking why I would do this days before her wedding. I told her gently that I'd tried for 2 months to resolve this without lawyers, without cameras, without any of it. I read her, calmly, the text her mother had sent Tyler weeks earlier, claiming everything was fully sorted. Chloe went quiet on the line for a long moment before saying, "She told me the same thing." That call changed something in her voice. Not toward me, exactly, but away from her mother's version of events. The first crack of doubt I'd heard from anyone in the Ashworth family all summer. Debbie, undeterred by the injunction, called an emergency HOA meeting for that Saturday, framing it publicly as an urgent community conversation about protecting Silver Pine traditions from outside legal interference. At that meeting, she stood before nearly 80 residents, describing me as a man who'd weaponized lawyers against a bride, carefully omitting every forged document, every fine irregularity, every recording Priya had already shared privately with half the room. I stood up, calm, and simply read the county deed number aloud, then asked whether anyone present had ever actually seen the original usage agreement with my supposed signature on it. Nobody raised a hand. Debbie called the question beside the point and pivoted quickly to a vote authorizing alternative wedding logistics on the shared community lawn, which passed, though noticeably with several visible abstentions this time. Ruth stood afterward and, in her steady courtroom voice, asked publicly why reserve fund statements hadn't been distributed at the last 3 meetings as required by the HOA's own bylaws. Debbie said it was an administrative delay. The treasurer, cornered by the question in front of the whole room, finally admitted he'd submitted the statements months earlier and had no explanation for why residents never received them. Debbie quickly adjourned the meeting. Walking out, 3 separate neighbors thanked me quietly, almost apologetically, for finally saying out loud what half the community had whispered about for years but never dared to confront directly at a public meeting. That night, Sarah asked if I regretted any of it. I told her the only thing I regretted was not doing it 2 years sooner, before Debbie's habits had time to calcify into something this deeply rooted. Debbie, however, wasn't done. On Sunday, alternative venue signs appeared on the shared community lawn, but by Monday evening, a new set of contractors arrived at my dock anyway, this time claiming final teardown of prior materials. My trail camera caught them instead, reinforcing the floating platform's anchor points. Exactly the kind of work you do if you had no intention of actually moving the ceremony at all. I called Dale immediately. He filed an emergency motion for contempt, citing direct violation of the injunction barely 4 days after it was issued, a filing the judge's clerk agreed to expedite given the short timeline. Debbie's lawyer argued the contractors were merely removing temporary materials, an explanation that collapsed the moment Dale submitted time-stamped footage of new anchor bolts being drilled directly into the dock support pilings. The judge scheduled an emergency contempt hearing for Wednesday, 2 days before the wedding, warning both parties that any further violation would carry personal financial penalties against whoever authorized the work. Debbie, cornered publicly for the first time, sent word through Harlan Voss that she would comply fully going forward, though something in the message's careful wording made Dale visibly uneasy rather than relieved. Ruth, reading the same message over my shoulder, said quietly, "That's not compliance. That's a woman buying 2 days to figure out something else entirely." I believed her more than I wanted to. Tuesday morning, an HOA-wide email went out announcing the wedding would proceed as planned on the water, per tradition, with no mention of any legal proceedings whatsoever, as if the entire courthouse chapter had simply never happened. I forwarded it straight to Dale, who forwarded it straight to the judge's clerk, requesting the contempt hearing be moved up a full day given the community was actively being told the injunction didn't exist. The judge agreed to hear the matter Tuesday afternoon instead, an emergency session that Debbie's lawyer clearly hadn't expected. judging by how quickly Harlan Voss requested a short continuance that the judge flatly denied. In that hearing, Debbie testified that the wedding email had been a miscommunication from the events committee, a claim immediately undercut when Dale produced the sender address, which traced directly back to Debbie's own HOA account. The judge, visibly running low on patience, issued a stern warning. Any event held on my dock parcel before ownership was fully resolved would result in daily fines against Debbie personally, not the HOA as an entity. Debbie left that hearing pale for the first time all summer, and for a few hours, I genuinely believed the fight might finally be over, that reason and consequence had finally caught up with 9 years of habit. Wednesday morning, however, Chloe called me again, this time in tears, saying her mother had told her the judge basically approved everything, and that Mark just likes making trouble for attention. A sentence that told me everything about how Debbie processed losing. I stayed calm, and simply forwarded Chloe the actual court order myself. Plain language, no interpretation needed, the exact opposite of what her mother had described to her that morning. Chloe went quiet again, then said something that stuck with me for days. I don't even recognize half of what she's told me this month. I told her I was sorry she was learning it this way. Days before her wedding. Thursday, the day before the ceremony, passed with unnerving calm. No new contractors. No new signs. Been seen publicly since Tuesday's hearing, which Ruth found far more suspicious than reassuring. She's not backing down, Ruth said flatly over coffee that morning. She's rerouting. Gracefully. She just changes which rule she's planning to break next. That evening, my trail camera caught something strange. A small barge, unrelated to the previous contractors, delivering folding chairs and a portable sound system directly onto the public boat launch beside my property. Not my dock itself. I studied the footage carefully with Dale. Technically, the boat launch was shared public access, not part of my deeded parcel, meaning Debbie had found a loophole that didn't technically violate the injunction's exact wording. Dale explained that if the ceremony itself occurred on the public launch and simply faced my dock, without anyone physically standing on my property, we'd have a much weaker case to stop it entirely by morning. I barely slept that night, replaying every angle of my own shoreline, wondering exactly how close facing my dock could legally come before it crossed back into a trespass I could actually challenge in court. Friday morning arrived bright and warm, wedding day, and by 6 a.m., I could already hear trucks rumbling along the lake road, delivery vans, a catering truck, the unmistakable sound of an event determined to happen no matter what. Sarah found me on the porch with coffee, watching white folding chairs multiply along the public launch exactly as predicted, close enough to my dock that guests would inevitably wander onto it within minutes of arriving. I called Dale one more time before the ceremony's scheduled 2 o'clock start. He confirmed the injunction technically only covered my deeded parcel, meaning enforcement would depend entirely on whether guests physically crossed that boundary once things began. Ruth arrived at my porch around noon, carrying a folder and a small tape measure, saying quietly, "If she's going to play games with feet and inches, we're going to know exactly where every one of them lands." By 1 o'clock, the public launch had transformed into a small outdoor chapel. White chairs facing the water, string lights already glowing faintly against the afternoon sun, and my own dock sitting directly behind the makeshift altar. At 1:30, I watched Debbie arrive in a pale blue dress, directing final details with the calm precision of a woman who believed, once again, that she had found the crack in the wall that let her win anyway. I stood at my property line with Ruth, a surveyor's stake freshly hammered into the exact legal boundary, watching guests slowly gather, watching Chloe's bridesmaids begin arranging flowers, watching the whole thing tilt inevitably toward my own shoreline. At 2 o'clock sharp, the string quartet began playing, and within minutes, exactly as I feared, half the wedding party had drifted casually past the boundary stake and directly onto my private dock to get a better view. I didn't stop them yet. Every foot that crossed the line, time-stamped, methodical, the same discipline Ruth had taught me weeks earlier, because a scene like this needed proof more than it needed a scene. By 2:15, catering staff had begun setting up a small dessert table directly on my dock's edge, and a groomsman was tying decorative ribbon to my own dock post as though it were simply part of the venue. I called Dale, who was already on standby, and told him what I was watching happen in real time. He said quietly, "Mark, that's not ambiguous anymore. That's a clear, deliberate trespass, happening exactly as she planned it." 2:30. Debbie herself walked out onto my dock to greet arriving guests personally, gesturing toward the water like a tour host, fully aware, judging by her posture, exactly whose property she was standing on. I walked down to the boundary stake and asked her plainly, in front of several guests, to remove her family and staff from my private dock immediately. She smiled at the small crowd and said, "Mark, please, not today." "Today especially," I said. She turned to the nearest guests and murmured something about difficult neighbors, the exact same tactic she'd used in every meeting all summer, except this time an actual audience was watching it happen live. A groomsman, embarrassed, quietly stepped back off my dock. Debbie noticed and, instead of following his lead, deliberately walked further out toward the end, as if daring me to escalate the moment in front of 100 guests. Tyler's father approached me privately, apologetic, saying he had no idea the location was contested and would gladly help move things if given even 15 minutes. I told him I appreciated that more than he knew. Debbie overheard and cut in sharply, telling him there was nothing to move. The situation was already resolved. A statement directly contradicted by the surveyor's stake sitting 6 feet from where she stood. At 2:45, I called the county sheriff's non-emergency line, calmly explaining an active trespass in progress on a legally injuncted property, giving the address, the parcel number, and the exact time the violation began. The dispatcher said deputies were already nearby on an unrelated call and would arrive shortly, a detail that, in hindsight, mattered more than I could have possibly known standing there watching string lights sway over my own dock. Debbie, meanwhile, began the ceremony early, apparently sensing something had shifted, rushing Chloe down the aisle 10 minutes ahead of schedule while half her guests were still finding their seats along the public launch. I stood at the boundary stake, phone recording, watching my own dock post decorated in white ribbon, watching a bride I genuinely felt sorry for walk toward an altar built partly on land that was never legally theirs to use. Chloe reached the altar, and for one strange moment, everything looked almost peaceful. The lake calm, the light golden, the guests hushed, as if the entire legal war behind it had simply evaporated for a few private minutes. Then, right on cue, A sheriff's cruiser rolled slowly down the lake road, lights off but unmistakable, and I watched Debbie's face change the instant she spotted it over her daughter's shoulder mid-ceremony. The officiant, to his credit, kept going, reading vows aloud as two deputies quietly approached the boundary stake where Ruth and I stood. Folders already prepared, timestamps ready, everything organized exactly as Dale had instructed weeks earlier. The deputies, low-voiced, confirmed the injunction was active and asked whether I wanted immediate enforcement or whether I preferred to let the ceremony finish first. I hesitated only a second before saying, "Let them finish the vows." Just the vows. That single choice, I think, mattered more than anything else I did that day, because it meant whatever happened next couldn't be spun as me destroying a wedding out of spite. I gave them the vows. The moment, "I now pronounce you," left the officiant's mouth, the deputies stepped forward and calmly informed Debbie that continued occupation of the dock parcel constituted contempt of a standing court order, effective immediately. Debbie's composure finally cracked, right there in front of nearly 200 guests, insisting loudly that this is a wedding, not a crime scene, while a deputy patiently explained that court orders didn't pause for celebrations. Chloe, still in her dress, looked between her mother and the deputies with an expression I'll never forget, somewhere between humiliation and something that looked almost like relief that this had finally, publicly, come to a head. Guests began murmuring, phones quietly rising, the exact kind of attention Debbie had spent 9 years avoiding by controlling every narrative before it reached a wider audience. Today, there was no controlling 200 witnesses at once. The reception moved hastily onto the public lawn portion, proceeded in a strange, brittle atmosphere, half the guests whispering about what they just watched, the other half pretending nothing unusual had happened at all. I stayed at the boundary stake with Ruth for another 20 minutes, watching caterers scramble to relocate tables, watching Debbie disappear into a side tent with Harlan Voss. Phone pressed hard against her ear the entire time. Sarah found me there, quietly slipping her hand into mine, saying only, "You didn't ruin anything today." She did that months ago. Today just finally showed everyone the receipts. I wanted so badly to believe her completely. That evening, footage from at least 6 different guest phones had already made its way onto social media, showing deputies calmly speaking with Debbie mid-reception, captions ranging from confused to openly gleeful within hours. By midnight, a local community Facebook group had over 300 comments, longtime residents finally sharing their own stories of unfair fines, forged paperwork, and years of quiet fear about crossing Deborah Ashworth publicly. Priya, watching the thread grow, finally posted her own account, describing the reserve fund conversation she'd recorded months earlier. Careful and factual. No accusations beyond exactly what she'd personally witnessed in board meetings. By Saturday morning, the county clerk's office had received 4 separate written complaints requesting a formal audit of Silver Pine's HOA finances, referencing the same reserve account discrepancies Ruth had been tracking for over a year. Debbie tried releasing a statement through the HOA newsletter, calling the wedding incident a private family matter blown out of proportion by a hostile neighbor, a framing that landed badly against footage of deputies at her daughter's altar. Chloe, to everyone's surprise, posted her own statement that Sunday, thanking guests for their support but adding, quietly, that she'd learned some hard truths about my mother this week that I'm still processing, without elaborating further. Tyler's family, previously silent, confirmed publicly they'd paid Renata's outstanding catering balance themselves that week. A detail that quietly corroborated everything Renata had told me privately weeks earlier about unpaid HOA event invoices. Gary finally spoke up too, releasing a short statement to the board admitting he'd known about certain irregularities for some time and had failed to act. A rare moment of accountability that surprised almost everyone who knew him. By Monday, the county had opened a preliminary financial review of the HOA reserve account, citing Priya's recording, the treasurer's inconsistent statements, and Renata's documented unpaid invoices as sufficient grounds to proceed formally. Debbie, cornered on multiple fronts now, requested an emergency closed-session board meeting, which Priya's earlier resignation made procedurally awkward, since the board technically lacked the quorum required without her replacement seated first. 3 residents, including Ruth, filed formal petitions demanding Debbie's immediate suspension pending the financial review, citing the HOA's own bylaws regarding conflicts of interest and misuse of authority for personal events. The following Thursday's regular meeting drew the largest crowd Silver Pine had ever seen. Over 100 residents packed into a room built for 40, all waiting to hear how Debbie would explain herself this time. She arrived without Harlan Voss, without a prepared statement, and for the first time in 9 years, without the calm control that had carried her through every previous confrontation with barely a raised eyebrow. Before she could speak, the acting vice president opened by reading the county's preliminary audit letter aloud, confirming roughly $31,000 in reserve fund transfers over 3 years lacking proper documentation or board approval. The room went completely silent. Debbie tried to speak. Something about temporary allocations always intended to be repaid. But her voice cracked halfway through, the first genuine crack I'd heard from her all summer. Someone in the back asked directly whether any of that money had funded Chloe's wedding preparations. Debbie didn't answer, far more completely than any statement could have. Ruth stood and calmly read from her file. The widow fined for landscaping, Debbie's own unpermitted renovation, the forged doc signature, the fabricated newsletter consent, laid out chronologically, dry and devastating, without a single raised voice. Priya then played her recording aloud for the room, Debbie's own voice instructing the treasurer to move some of the dues money into events. We'll true it up before the audit, filling the silent room completely. Gary, seated in the back row for once instead of beside his wife, put his head in his hands. Whatever loyalty had kept him quiet for years finally seemed to run out in that exact moment. Publicly, painfully, someone called for an immediate vote of no confidence. The acting vice president, visibly nervous but resolute, called it to the floor, and within minutes the board voted 5-1 to suspend Debbie pending full investigation. Debbie stood, gathered her things with shaking hands, and said only, "You'll all regret this," before walking out of a meeting she had controlled completely for 9 straight years. For the very last time, I felt no triumph watching her leave, only a strange, quiet exhaustion, the kind that comes after carrying something heavy for months and finally being allowed to set it down in front of witnesses. Outside, Chloe was waiting by her car, having heard everything through the propped open door. She caught my eye briefly, said nothing, and got in without a word. though her expression held none of Debbie's old defiance anymore. The days that followed moved strangely fast. The county formally expanded its financial review, requesting 3 additional years of HOA records, and a local news reporter called asking whether I'd be willing to speak on record. I hesitated. About attention. Only about a doc, a deed, and a summer I'd wanted my son to remember for kayaking, not court dates. Eventually, I agreed, but kept my statement short and factual. The reporter also spoke with Ruth, Priya, and the widow who'd been fined years earlier, building a piece that framed the whole affair not as one dock dispute, but as 9 years of unchecked power finally catching up at once. Harlan Voss quietly withdrew as Debbie's attorney the following week, citing a conflict of interest, though Dale suspected it had more to do with the county subpoenaing several emails routed through Harlan's own office. Debbie retreated from public view almost entirely, no longer attending the pool, the mailbox cluster, or the small farmers market the community held on Sundays, a silence that felt less like humility than pure strategy. Gary, surprisingly, reached out to me directly, asking to meet at the diner in town. He apologized plainly, said he should have stopped enabling his wife's decisions years earlier, and admitted the marriage was likely ending regardless of the audit's outcome. I didn't know what to say to that, so I mostly listened, and left with the strange feeling that Gary's quiet compliance all those years had cost this community almost as much as Debbie's aggression ever had. Chloe reached out too, weeks later, asking to meet privately. She apologized for the wedding day, said she hadn't known the full extent of her mother's tactics, and admitted the marriage her parents modeled had left her genuinely unprepared for conflict. I told her honestly that none of it had ever been her fault, that kids don't choose the lessons their parents teach them, only whether they keep repeating them once they're grown. She seemed to actually hear that. Meanwhile, the county audit progressed steadily, uncovering a pattern stretching back nearly 6 years. Skimmed reserve funds, inflated vendor invoices routed through a company registered to Debbie's sister, and repeated falsified meeting minutes hiding board dissent. Renata was finally paid in full once the audit froze remaining HOA accounts pending resolution. A small but satisfying footnote given everything she'd risked by speaking honestly to Dale months earlier when it mattered most. Priya was unanimously voted onto the board's interim leadership committee, alongside Ruth, who initially declined before agreeing, just long enough to fix what's broken. A phrase everyone in that room understood completely by then. I was asked, more than once, to run for board president myself in the fall election. I declined, still uninterested in power, though I did agree to chair a new bylaws committee focused specifically on preventing exactly what had just happened. The dock itself, ironically, became something of a local landmark. Neighbors occasionally walking past just to see the wedding dock, always followed by someone retelling the story slightly differently than the last person had. Cole, my son, mostly just wanted his summer back, kayaking off our newly quiet dock most afternoons, blissfully uninterested in HOA bylaws, occasionally asking if the wedding lady was ever coming back to bother us again. I told him honestly I didn't think so, though some small part of me still checked the trail camera footage most mornings out of 9 years of accumulated habit that wasn't easy to simply switch off overnight. The formal county findings arrived in late August. Sufficient evidence for criminal referral on misappropriation of HOA funds, forwarded to the district attorney's office for further review. alongside a civil recommendation that Debbie personally repay the missing reserves. Debbie's response, delivered through a new attorney, denied any criminal intent, blaming poor bookkeeping practices and informal community customs, a defense that landed about as well with the DA's office as it had with the county auditor. By early September, formal charges were filed: misappropriation of association funds and falsifying financial records, with an arraignment date set for October. News that spread through Silver Pine faster than any newsletter Debbie had ever printed herself. I learned about the charges the same way most of the neighborhood did, through a group chat screenshot forwarded at least a dozen times before lunch, each version adding slightly more detail than the last. Ruth called that afternoon, her voice steady but unmistakably relieved, saying only, 2 years of quiet paperwork. Mark. Sometimes that's exactly what finally moves faster than anyone expects once the right person finally says enough. Sarah and I sat on the dock that evening, watching the sunset Debbie had once tried to claim for a stranger ceremony. And for the first time all summer, the water felt entirely, unmistakably ours again. Word came a week later that Gary had filed for divorce quietly, citing irreconcilable differences, a filing nobody in the neighborhood found remotely surprising given everything that had surfaced over the preceding months. Debbie, facing mounting legal bills, listed her lake house for sale within the month. A small, almost poetic detail given how much of her identity had been wrapped up in controlling that exact stretch of shoreline for 9 years. Chloe and Tyler, meanwhile, quietly held a second, smaller ceremony at Tyler's family's property 2 counties over. No HO, no doc disputes, just close family, which Chloe later told me felt like an actual wedding this time. I wasn't invited, and didn't expect to be, though Chloe did send a short message afterward thanking me for never once being cruel to her, during a summer when plenty of people would have understood if I had been. The Community Bylaws Committee I'd agreed to chair met for the first time in mid-September, drafting new rules requiring board financial statements distributed automatically each quarter. No request required. No delays permitted without formal written justification. We also drafted a clear policy prohibiting HOA-sponsored events on privately deeded parcels without notarized written consent. A rule everyone in that room understood existed because of one very specific, very recent lakeside wedding. Priya, now interim board secretary, implemented recorded meeting minutes as standard practice going forward, no longer relying on anyone's private phone or personal risk to keep the board honestly accountable to its own residents. The reserve fund, once fully audited, showed a final shortfall just over $38,000, a number the county ordered Debbie to repay in full as part of any negotiated resolution to the pending criminal charges. Harlan Voss, turned out, had also quietly represented 3 other HOA presidents across the county facing similar reserve fund irregularities, a pattern local reporters eventually connected in a wider story about small community boards operating with almost no oversight. I gave one final interview once the criminal case became public record. Careful, factual, focused less on vindication and more on warning other homeowners that patient documentation, not anger, was what had actually turned this fight around. The reporter asked if I had any regrets about cutting things so close to the actual wedding day itself instead of stopping it earlier. I told her honestly there was one thing I still hadn't fully explained publicly yet. October arrived, and with it, Debbie's arraignment date, held at the same county courthouse where our injunction hearing had taken place months earlier, though this time the gallery was noticeably larger and considerably less sympathetic toward her. She pleaded not guilty through her new attorney, setting a trial date for the following spring. Though local reporters noted the DA's office seemed unusually confident given the volume of documentation already assembled against her. Outside the courthouse, a reporter asked me directly whether I felt satisfied with how everything had unfolded. I said I felt tired, mostly, and that satisfaction wasn't really the word for watching a community heal from something like this. That evening, Ruth invited a small group over. Priya, Renata, the widow who'd been unfairly fined years earlier, Sarah and me, an informal gathering that felt less like celebration and more like quiet, mutual relief finally shared aloud. Renata mentioned, almost as an aside, that 3 other HOA event clients had already reached out to her privately since the story broke, asking pointed questions about their own community's reserve fund transparency for the very first time. The widow, whose landscaping fine had started Ruth's file 2 years earlier, finally received a formal refund from the HOA that week, alongside a written apology drafted by the new interim board, a small, overdue correction years in the making. I told the group the detail I'd held back from the reporter earlier that day, the actual moment I decided to cut the mooring rope on the floating dance platform, which I hadn't done during the ceremony itself. But later that night, after the reception ended and guests had gone home, the floating platform, still tethered loosely to my dock post per Debbie's earlier temporary reinforcement, sat abandoned in the dark water, decorations still strung, cake table still standing. Nobody from the HOA had returned to properly remove or secure it that night, apparently assuming the matter was settled once the ceremony concluded, leaving an entire unauthorized structure tied illegally to a dock I now had every legal right to clear. Around 11 that night, with deputies' knowledge and Dale's explicit blessing given the standing injunction, I walked out with a utility knife and simply cut the mooring line myself, letting the whole abandoned platform drift slowly out into open water. It wasn't rage that made me do it. Not exactly. It was closure, a physical, undeniable way of finally, literally, releasing something from my property that never should have been tied there in the first place. The platform drifted for nearly 40 minutes before the Marina Patrol spotted it near the lake's center. String lights still faintly glowing. A lone abandoned cake stand tipping slowly into the dark water as it rocked gently in the current. Someone had captured the whole thing on video from a nearby porch. The little floating stage glowing softly against black water. Utterly alone. Utterly adrift. Footage that would later circulate online captioned simply, "The wedding that finally floated away." By the time Marina Patrol towed it back to the public launch near dawn, half the neighborhood had already seen the footage, laughing, sharing, finally allowed to feel something other than quiet fear about the whole Ashworth situation. Dale later joked that no jury in the world could call reclaiming your own dock post after an expired, unauthorized, abandoned event vindictive, and technically, legally, he was completely right about that from the very first phone call. The group at Ruth's house laughed harder at that story than at anything else all evening. Not out of cruelty toward Chloe's actual wedding, but at the sheer, poetic absurdity of Debbie's ambition finally drifting quietly out to sea. Priya said it best, raising her glass slightly. 9 years of control. And in the end, she couldn't even keep her own daughter's dance floor tied down properly. Nobody argued with that summary all evening. I drove home that night thinking less about Debbie and more about Cole, asleep upstairs, who'd get his quiet mornings on that dock back completely, without fences, without warning letters, without a single stranger's wedding platform drifting past his kayak. Sarah found me still awake on the porch afterward, and asked what I was thinking about. I told her honestly, just how strange it was that the whole fight had ended with something literally, physically drifting away for good. The following spring, Debbie's criminal trial proceeded exactly as the DA's office had expected. The reserve fund evidence, Priya's recording, and Renata's documented invoices forming a case her new attorney struggled meaningfully to counter at any point. She was convicted on the misappropriation charge, sentenced to restitution payments alongside a suspended jail term contingent on repaying the full $38,000, a resolution the county called appropriate given her lack of prior record. Gary's divorce finalized around the same time, and he moved into a small condo across the lake, occasionally waving politely if we crossed paths at the hardware store, both of us carrying our own separate versions of that summer. Chloe and Tyler, by then a full year into their actual marriage, sent a short holiday card that December. A simple photo. No mention of the wedding at all. Just a quiet, ordinary life moving forward on its own terms. Silver Pine's new board, led by Priya with Ruth still consulting from the sidelines, finished its first full year with transparent quarterly financial reports, 0 disputed fines, and a noticeably calmer tone at every single monthly meeting since. I still serve on the bylaws committee, mostly out of habit now rather than urgency, reviewing the occasional minor dispute that gets resolved in an afternoon instead of a summer. Exactly the way community disagreements probably always should have worked. My dock, repaired and quietly reinforced that following spring, became simply mine again. No laminated signs, no strangers' floating platforms, just Cole's kayak, Sarah's evening coffee, and the ordinary, unremarkable piece we'd bought that lake house for originally. Occasionally, new residents ask about the wedding story they'd heard secondhand, usually some exaggerated version involving a bride falling into the lake, which never actually happened, though I've mostly stopped correcting the details at this point. What actually happened was simpler, and somehow more satisfying. A woman who spent 9 years believing rules existed only for other people finally learned, publicly, undeniably, that they hadn't stopped applying to her the entire time. Ruth, retired properly now from her file-keeping days, still waves from her porch most evenings, occasionally reminding me, with a small satisfied smile, that patience and paperwork had outlasted 9 years of somebody else's confidence. Priya eventually ran for board president herself the following fall, winning easily, campaigning on exactly one promise: total financial transparency, delivered without exception. A promise the whole community now watched her keep quietly every single quarter. Renata's business grew steadily that year. Several new HOA clients specifically requesting her precisely because her invoices, unlike certain past arrangements, were always paid promptly, publicly, and completely on schedule going forward. The widow whose landscaping fine had started Ruth's file used her refund to finally finish the garden she'd wanted for years. A small, quiet correction to something that never should have cost her anything in the first place. Harlan Voss, tangled in the wider county investigation involving other HOA boards, eventually surrendered his license to practice, A footnote: most of Silverpine only half followed, having mostly moved on with their own ordinary lives by then. Gary sent me one last letter that spring. Brief, almost formal, thanking me for finally doing what none of us had the courage to do for years. Signed simply, Gary. No further explanation attached or apparently needed. I framed it, oddly, not out of pride, but as a reminder that quiet complicity costs communities just as much as loud control does. A lesson I hoped Cole would understand fully once he was old enough to need it. Debbie herself moved 2 counties over after selling the lake house, and word eventually filtered back that she'd tried, briefly, to join another HOA board there, only for her name to arrive well before she did. That community, having read the same news coverage as everyone else, declined her application within a week. A small, distant epilogue that reached Silverpine mostly as a passing rumor nobody bothered fact-checking too closely. Cole, now 13, barely remembers the specifics of that summer, mostly recalling the time a wedding dance floor floated away at night, a story he now tells his own friends with considerably more embellishment than actually occurred. Sarah and I still sit on that dock most evenings, watching the same sunset Debbie once tried to claim for a stranger's ceremony. Grateful, mostly, that an entire ordinary life had simply been allowed to quietly resume. Looking back, I don't think of that summer as a fight I won so much as a pattern that finally ran out of places left to hide. One deed, one recording, one unpaid invoice at a time. Ruth once told me the real twist of the whole story wasn't the forged signature, or the embezzled funds, or even the drifting platform, but simply that ordinary, quiet neighbors had been sitting on the truth the entire time, waiting. I think about that often. How many fines, how many quiet fears, how many unread reserve statements it actually took before enough people finally stopped assuming somebody else would eventually be the one to speak up first. The bylaws committee still meets quarterly, mostly reviewing minor landscaping questions now, occasionally reminding new residents why the written consent for private parcels rule exists, usually followed by someone retelling a slightly different version of that July. I never did get a full apology from Debbie directly, only that one unsigned letter forwarded through Gary months later. Brief, almost businesslike, admitting she'd underestimated how far she'd let things go over the years. I didn't need the apology by then. Honestly, the county audit, the criminal conviction, the empty lake house listing, and one very public floating dance floor had already said everything that letter tried. Clumsily, to summarize months too late, the local paper ran a final follow-up piece that fall, framing the whole affair as a cautionary tale about small community boards operating without oversight, quoting PRIA's new transparency policies as a model other HOAs began quietly adopting statewide. Dale still jokes, whenever we run into each other at the courthouse, that the case remains his favorite quiet paperwork versus loud confidence story, one he still occasionally references, respectfully anonymized, when training newer attorneys at his firm. Chloe messaged me once more, nearly 2 years later, saying she and Tyler were expecting their first child, adding only that she hoped to raise them somewhere that valued actual honesty over appearances. A line that stayed with me for weeks. I told her I hoped the same for Cole, and meant it completely, understanding by then that the real damage Debbie had caused wasn't the fines or the forged paperwork, but the quiet distortion of what her own daughter believed was normal. Gary eventually moved further away, out of state, closer to his sister, and our occasional hardware store encounters simply stopped altogether. Quiet, undramatic ending to a relationship that had never really been mine to maintain in the first place. Debbie's restitution payments, monitored by the county, continued steadily according to public court records. The final installment scheduled roughly 4 years out. A slow, unglamorous consequence far less cinematic than the drifting platform, but arguably more meaningful. Silver Pine's community newsletter, once Debbie's personal instrument for 9 years, now runs a quarterly transparency corner, listing every reserve fund transaction plainly. A small, deliberate correction nobody on the new board ever needed to explain twice. I still keep the trail cameras up, mostly out of old habit now, occasionally catching nothing more dramatic than herons landing at dawn, or Cole's kayak drifting lazily past exactly where a stranger's dance floor once sat abandoned. Ruth passed away peacefully 2 winters later, and at her small lakeside memorial, half of Silver Pine showed up, many of them people she'd quietly protected for years through nothing more dramatic than a patient, well-organized file. I spoke briefly at that memorial, mentioning only the doc, the deed, and one very persistent woman who'd taught an entire community that patience, properly documented, eventually outlasts even the most confident abuse of power. Priya still serves as board president today. Her transparency policies now written permanently into Silver Pine's bylaws, requiring any future president to clear a formal financial audit before assuming office. A rule everyone simply calls Ruth's Rule now. Renata retired comfortably a few years later, having built her business's reputation partly on being the one vendor in the county who'd once quietly told the truth about Deborah Ashworth when it actually mattered. Sarah and I sold the lake house eventually, years later, once Cole left for college, though we kept photographs of that dock. Sunsets mostly, no dance floors, no laminated signs, just an ordinary, hard-won kind of peace. The new owners, we heard, still get asked occasionally about the wedding dock story, usually retold with some new exaggerated detail, a small, harmless piece of local folklore that outlived every single person actually involved in it. I think, sometimes, about how close I came to simply accepting Debbie's version of events that first week. Signing whatever she needed, letting the wedding happen, avoiding months of stress for the sake of easy neighborly peace. I'm glad I didn't, casting anger toward Debbie herself, but because Ruth's widow, Priya's courage, and Renata's honesty all needed exactly one person willing to keep documenting instead of quietly folding first. The lake, I've learned, doesn't actually care who claims to own its sunsets, its docks, or its shoreline traditions. It simply keeps moving steadily forward, carrying away whatever doesn't actually belong there in the first place. That's mostly how I remember that whole summer now. Not as triumph, not as revenge, but as one small, stubborn refusal to let somebody else's confidence quietly outweigh the plain, recorded truth sitting in a county filing cabinet the entire time. Cole, grown now, still tells the story occasionally at family gatherings, usually ending with the same line every time. And then Dad just cut the rope, delivered with the satisfied grin of someone who never had to live through the actual paperwork. I usually just smile at that version, letting the simplified ending stand, because in a way, it's not even wrong, just incomplete, missing the 2 months of quiet, patient documentation that made cutting that single rope possible at all. Every summer since, I sit on that same dock at sunset, watching the water Debbie once tried to claim, thinking less about her now than about how ordinary, hard-won peace feels once you've actually had to fight to keep it. Silver Pine Lake Estates today runs quieter, fairer, its reserve funds transparent, its board term limited, its bylaws finally strong enough to stop the next confident, patient person who might otherwise have tried exactly what Debbie once did. None of it happened because I was braver than anyone else. Only because I finally stopped assuming somebody else would document the truth first, and started keeping the file myself. One photograph, one deed, one honest conversation at a time. Some nights, I still glance out at the water and picture that little floating platform drifting alone under the stars. String lights glowing. Cake table empty. Finally, quietly carried away from a dock it never should have touched at all.